Non urlo perché sembrerei una pazza. Ho gli auricolari, sono in coda per entrare al creativation. Sono in coda. Così vi porto dentro. Mi sembra che abbiano già iniziato a far entrare, ma era un falso allarme. Vabbè, intanto stiamo in compagnia. Vediamo appena arrivate. Buongiorno, buonasera da voi, sono le 5, giusto? Ditemi solo se mi sentite perché non posso urlare perché sembrerei una matta, siamo qua tutti in fila, io ho gli auricolari, faccio finta di parlare al telefono anche se non è così. Ciao! Eccoci. Siamo in attesa di entrare. Questa è la fila. Miranda è al corso della Wow, dove dovrei essere anch'io. Solo dopo ho realizzato che era esattamente in coincidenza con l'apertura della fiera e quindi ciao. Andrò a prendermi il kit dopo e basta. Però volevo farvi, appena iniziano a farci entrare, giro la fotocamera e vi faccio vedere. Andiamo subito da T-Molds, quindi se non vi piace T-Molds buttate pure giù, non seguite più questo video perché si va subito lì. Buongiorno. Ho delle occhiaie, niente male, anche attraverso il video. Bello. Miranda è al corso della Wow. Allora, mi sembra che abbiano iniziato a far entrare qualcuno. Eccoci. Ok. Forse sono partita un po' troppo in anticipo con i video, quindi per un po' vedete il mio faccione. Però buongiorno, buonasera. Io col fuso orario ho assolutamente perso il contatto col... Ok, hanno aperto. Adesso tra poco giro la fotocamera. Poi ho un attimo di passaggio dove ci controllano il badge, ma poi andiamo subito da team. Ciao, sono la tua stalker italiana. E allora, giriamo la fotocamera. Stiamo entrando al creativation, adesso vediamo dove mi fermano per controllarmi il badge. Io spero che mi sentiate. Mi sentite? Perché non possiamo esattamente urlare e c'è parecchia confusione, però ho gli auricolari. Ah, non ci controllano neanche, va bene. Vabbè. Eccoci qua al creativation. Hi. Eccoci qua. Allora, dov'è la Ranger? Fatemi cercare. Ranger, laggiù, facile. Anche per chi come me non si orienta minimamente, cerchiamo di non calpestare. Tiziana, poi veniamo a fare un giro qua se ci sei, Tiziana. Allora andiamo subito alla Ranger perché cioè, io apro il creativation tutti gli anni così, tutti gli anni, cioè 4 anni. Allora, dove sarà T-Molds? Alice e Mario, quindi Tim sarà qua da qualche parte. Eccolo lì, arriviamo. Ma non c'è ancora nessuno, quindi sì. Adesso sto zitta.
Okay, you're looking down, that's okay. Because I'm going to do the live one here. So.
Sweet. All right, you get some stuff out, we'll get going.
Yeah.
Can you look at me and smile when you get a chance? That's good, Kim. That was perfect.
It wasn't that perfect? A little scary. All right. Let's go.
Just give me a minute when you go live. So I mean, when you go live.
Absolutely.
When you're
Just
done.
wait over
Just have to
here.
press the button. Yeah, there's more people coming.
He was shutting down there.
Water.
Well, I just need to
Yeah, for
get the
sure.
pipes ready.
Looking down.
Ovviamente non potevo che venire qua. E niente, mo stiamo qua finché non ci fa tutta la demo. E poi poi vado a prendere il kit del corso della Wow, che ho assolutamente paccato perché il creativation per me inizia con T-Molds. Adesso sto zitta però perché sennò... Modalità stalker assolutamente. Ma che scherzi. Adesso...
Perfect. Got Are we ready to go?
Yep.
We're ready. Thanks for waiting.
I have you on my
Make sure I'm on.
I know.
See?
Yeah, I'm waiting. I had you on my schedule on a different day. You guys, he's gonna pop up from underneath the desk like a jack in the box. Oh yeah, yours. Yeah, you're right. There he is. See, he just popped up like a jack in the box.
Yeah, I came up from the basement, so. All right, we excited. We are going to kick this off. Creativation 2020.
Yeah.
I know, right? Isn't that cool?
Your first group.
Whole new decade of creativity, man. We're ready to go. So I'm going to take you through and just talk about the highlights of what's new in the world of distress. For me, I'm always just looking for different ways that we can alter things that we do. And distress has come a long way throughout the years, from inks to paints and stains and crayons and markers and oxide, right? So new at the show are distress embossing glazes. And really, embossing glazes they're embossing powders. Yeah, that's what they are. There's nothing unique from its actual material, but what makes them unique in the world of distress is that these are all translucent. And that's why we called it a glaze. And an embossing powder, some embossing powders, most powders are opaque, right? When you have a black embossing powder or a red or a white, it's designed that when you put it on, that is the color. It doesn't matter what's under it. And there are some translucent powders in our world. There's many. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but I will say that these are designed that when they melt, they are always translucent, and its melted color is what mimics the coordinating distress color, right? So these are all distress glazes melted over a brown background, and you're welcome to pass it around and get your best money shot out of that. But the cool thing about it, as you can see, is that when they melt, besides that they melt to a beautiful shine, they are translucent, showing what's underneath. So if you put them over, like for example, distress ink, you're going to still see all of the drips, the texture, all of the stuff that you get with distress, but that color of glaze is tinting what it's over, right? So for example here, these swatches, yeah, feel free to pass them around, take a look and scan through them. So these swatches right here show you the glaze in action. You can use the glaze over something stamped. And just looking at this one tag, right? When you see this is just stamped in Black Set Archival, when you put the glaze over it, it even intensifies the black, right? It takes anything that you put over and almost magnifies it. Gives it just a beautiful effect. Now, in addition to the glaze, of course, I was like, well, how do I want to use these, right? So the inspiration really behind the glaze, besides adding color, we're all around these paper dolls and baseboard dolls. People are using these in everything, and they're even using their own photos now, so like this kind of gave them permission to print them out, cut them out, and just use them. And I wanted different ways that we can color them. And throughout the years, we've colored them with markers and crayons, but the glaze is really fun because not only does it tint it, but it gives it that shine. So these swatches are done strictly with the glaze. There's no ink used at all. Your color is just the glaze. And so that's how you can see this Tattered Rose has such a great effect, or Cracked Pistachio, or paint. And even whether it's going over light or dark, it completely changes it, and it gives it a great texture too. So these swatches really pass it around, like feel it. I always say in my Facebook Lives, like wish we had feel-o-vision, you know, where they could just like touch the screen and go, that's amazing. The cool thing about glazes as well is that the more you build, the more intense the color is. So anyone that understands distress ink that have used it, you know that the more color you add, the more intense. So you can build these up as well through a stencil, through all different things. And I wanted different ways that we could adhere our powders. Obviously we have embossing ink. That's what we've had this in the line, and this is if you're going to stamp with it or do whatever. But we needed some new tools as well. Now, again, there's nothing special to this particular liquid if you already have something similar, okay? If you have an embossing pen, there's nothing in this pen that makes it special to work with this. You need any kind of embossing pen, but because we do a line, we wanted it complete. So the Distress embossing pens are just pens that have embossing ink. There are two different tips in a package, a bullet and a brush. And that's just a nice way that we can apply clear ink and get our powders to stick to. So if you do lettering, you can do your hand lettering with a brush pen and put your glaze on. Or any of these that I wanted to add that glaze, I just colored with the pen, put the powder on, and off we go. The dabber, there's been a lot of embossing dabbers. Ranger still has one in their line, but it's that paint dabber with the foam. And when you're working in mixed media, you have to be careful with embossing ink. Embossing ink is glycerin. It's very slimy. If you ever felt it, it's that kind of greasy look. And if you're doing mixed media things, like you want to put this on something like metal or wood, this is all done with glaze, right? So here's just the back of that ideology clip. That's what it looks like. And this is what that clip looks like with hickory smoke glaze over the top. Totally changes it. right? So when you're embossing on metal or like on wood, these are the number blocks, right? And this is the glaze. You have some options here. To get this to stick, the nice thing about this dabber is it's just a fabric top, right? So just like a stamp cleaner or something like that, you're going to get a very light application of that ink. You're not going to get it really wet or goopy. So if you put too much embossing ink on metal, even though the powder will melt, it's going to wipe off because that ink has no place to go. So now it's trapped between plastic and metal and it's just going to slide off. So that's why we wanted a light way. Another cool thing, obviously, for the tag is I just took my dabber, swiped it on, put my glaze on it. So if you do art journaling or planning or chipboard, right, you can just take this and instead of smashing it into your ink pad, now we can just take our embossing dabber, put it on, and get our powder on there. So little things to kind of think about. Another cool thing about the glaze before I start cooking this up is that if you don't want it shiny, because it will dry shiny, you can get it to dry or melt matte. And the reason is it's not really changing how we do it. All you do is go over it with steel wool when it's done. You don't need to add any other mediums over the top. A little piece of steel wool after it melts and cools, you go over the top and that takes away that high gloss shine and gives you a really cool dimensional, almost wax-like look and feel.
Sandpaper?
So, sandpaper wouldn't because it would actually carve it out because it's still plastic. So this is just taking off the sheen. You can also use things like collage medium or gel medium painted over it to dull it down. But the easiest way for me is just a little steel wool, go over it, and there you go. So let's take some of these out. Let's cook them up.
Sì,
play
sì, si
around
può
with
indossare su un sacco di
I always
materiali.
like to, and
Poi
you know, I
cerco di
think in
prendere le
today's
paghe
world of makers,
e scappo.
we're swatch savvy now. We have swatches. We just like to make swatches, even if we don't do anything else with them.
No,
Like, we have
that's what we
swatches.
do, the swatches.
That's what we have. I took them out of the crayon tin, so the jars do fit in a distressed crayon tin if you're looking for a storage option. But the powders, don't be fooled by the color on the jar. We're still going to get a translucent look. So if you're expecting, like if you're matching this up and saying, oh, I want this really bright turquoise when I do it, you're going to need to put something white over this. So another thing to think about with glaze is any ink that you would normally emboss with, a pigment ink, paint, you can still use under the glaze. Don't think like you can only use these sticky things. Even distressed people, right? You can emboss with distress ink. So we can still stamp with a color, emboss with a different color glaze, and get a whole different kind of thing going on. This one right here, this is showing texture paste, which is a white paste. It's not part of the distress line, but any embossing paste, because it is white, these glazes were sprinkled over the top of it and then embossed. And you can see that that's what's going to give you a truer color, because now we have a white foundation. We're not seeing through it. We're just getting that white to reflect it. So it's really nice that we can take these colors, and I just went in and sprinkled them just to show you that because they are translucent, all of them, and because they are a plastic, so when they melt, they become liquid, that if you went in and you just started sprinkling them on, so I put my paste on, and while my paste was wet, I sprinkled on my glazes. I did my little tap dance, because when you do that, it's what gets the colors to bounce. In other words, if I sprinkled my color and I did this, whatever was here dominated everything else, right? You ever done that? Tried to color the powder and you flick it? That last color just covered everything. So if you just do the dance, that's going to get all these colors to start popping around and sticking into different random areas. And when they melt, they will actually blend, just like a color would, because it's melted plastic. So when you heat this, where that green overlaps that blue, overlaps that brown, that powder starts to melt, and you can get really cool, authentic, very unique looking glaze combos.
Does the paste need to have any special features so that I can emboss it? Can we use any embossing paste, or?
I think you could use any. I mean, I've only used Ranger, so
of course.
But I would suggest trying with what you have.
Okay.
Yeah. The thing about paste that you have to be careful with, some paste gets really puffy, like marshmallow. You know, so if that's happening, you may want to let it dry first. Meaning, put the paste on, put your glaze on, and then let it dry. So the powder's now stuck to the paste. But if you let the paste dry before you heat emboss it, you probably won't get that marshmallow explosion, right?
But you did this, you dried it right away after.
Yeah, because I know that you really should feel it. You're going to see that it's got a real nuggety texture because the texture paste can handle heat drop.
Okay.
Well, you know me, I'm super impatient.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I forget, if I don't do it right away, I'm going to kill it. All right, let's go in.
Poi proviamo a casa.
Just to show you how this works. So the dabber itself, it is a thick embossing ink. So when you press down, you can apply a little bit of pressure to get some ink out, but if you go in and just squeeze this, you'll pop this sucker right off. Done it, okay? Right? Because it's not designed to flood color. And I was so used to like a paint dabber or a stain where I'm like squeezing and pushing down, just like pop it back on and know to never do that again. But I don't know if your camera's picking this up. I tried to do it on the mat just to show you the shine. There is ink that is coming out of this. I'll just show you. You see that little bit of shine right there?
Yeah.
It's just a very faint. That's what it's for. That's
Vabbè.
all you need. So if we're going to do this over something, let's just take a stamp.
Will you see it wet? Like it will show wet?
It will show wet. So I'm going to do my best because I know you guys are videoing. So I want to play to you guys. So just like dip it this way, this way.
Like a movie.
It is like a movie. I'll take this block. So I'll just take a little flourish. Let's put this down. We'll stamp with some archival. Any color archival, but I'll just show you black. So I know a lot of people just like to stamp.
So you're gonna, okay, so you're stamping.
I'm just going to stamp so you can see the glaze over an image. I think when you see it happen, it's so much more
And you're
impactful.
using archival because it won't move after
Correct.
you put your, okay.
But technically, you could stamp with distress because this plays well over distress.
Oh, nice.
See
So
that?
by oxides.
Yeah. So it will play beautiful over oxide. I have a sample. I'm that what if child. Okay. So this was me saying, okay, if I did a tag in oxide, so this was aged mahogany oxide. And when I first did the glaze, I'm like, well, I'm sure I could achieve the same thing with clear embossing powder. Like, let's be honest, plastic. So this was clear. Well, it did nothing. Like, it's boring. It was very boring to me. I'm like, okay, well now it just kind of looks like a weird milky streak. This right here is fired brick. So when I put fired brick over that, I'm like, okay, now we've got some deep color. It brought, I thought, more depth in. And then after it cooled, like, I wonder if we could just, would it still stay pliable? Could I still break it? Could I still die cut it? And I mean, feel it, it's not going to chip off, but it changes the surface of that paper. That to me is what's unique about a medium, is to, although it's an embossing powder, just don't treat it like an embossing powder. You can still stamp and emboss. You could go through just with a stamped image, but it's really designed to like be used with distress. Don't be afraid of it. All right, so here I'm just going to take this. I'm just going to stamp on cardstock. I just happen to be stamping on watercolor cardstock just for the sake of stamping. All right, I'll just clean it off the way I like to.
Hey everyone, we hope you all downloaded the creativation mobile app and are using it to navigate the event, your schedule, and plan for the show floor. We recommend regularly pressing the refresh button on your creativation app, located in the top right-hand corner on the home screen, to ensure you're seeing the most up-to-date information. If you have any questions, please visit the show office. Have fun out here.
Okay. So I just wanted my archival to dry. It doesn't really matter. Archival's a pretty fast drying ink, but I'm a chronic heat tool user because I'm that guy that like will forget that step, so it just becomes very automatic. So I'm just going to take the dabber and I'm just going to start swiping over this and just try to get you to see. Can you see that little shine right there? You see just that little bit of shimmer? It's not a lot. That's the whole idea. It's not supposed to be. So we can dab this out. I can go around the edge and I'm just going to swipe over this. Just in part of the area. I didn't dry it completely, and that's okay. All right. So now we'll take color of glaze. A little bit of practice.
Non fatemi ridere.
And I'm just going to pour this on. Now again, if you want to mix, you can mix. If you want to thin your color, like I've even played with taking glaze and also mixing it with just clear embossing powder to get like a more translucent, right? So if you think, oh, that color is a little too green and I want it to be softer, that's okay, mix your powders ahead of time. You know, take a little cup, do one part clear to one part this, and you'll get even more translucent color. And I say that meaning it's not going to lighten the color, but because you're going to have less of those granules, it just gets a little speckly. It's pretty neat. So you could definitely play around with your different
That
colors.
very neat. I would have had it everywhere.
Cardstock,
gotta have a tray.
cardstock is your friend.
I know,
Because
but I
it
would
creates a
have had
nice
it.
little funnel, and then of course
have a
someone
tray
else's
with
carpet
edges.
is also your friend.
That's true. Someone else's carpet.
This is how we do it. All right, so you can see here that I just have glaze over there, and that glaze is very dulling, right? It dulls that stamped image. So we're going to emboss it. Now, I'm a firm believer in different tools, okay? This is Granger's Heat Tool. If you see any videos, I use it. It's a craft tool. I use it for crafting. I use it for drying ink, drying paint, drying glue. It's a craft tool. Although it says you can emboss with it, you could if you had unlimited time, right? If you had 20 minutes to emboss this, I guess you would. An embossing gun, these are both the same temperature, but this focuses heat. Any embossing gun focuses that temperature in one area, and that's what melts the powder quicker. So that's why I use an embossing bag, any embossing bag. Always heat it up. You'll know if it's hot by just sticking your hand in front of it. And then another trick to embossing is hold your paper up, okay? If you have sensitive fingers, use a clothespin, right? Something to grab onto it. But by holding this up, this is going to allow the heat to pass through the paper, and it embosses almost instantly. And that's what it should do. You can see how that color just changed right away. Right? See that dark black and that color? So anytime you're embossing, even a card, if you can just hold it off of the table, it allows your heat to go through your paper. And not only will it emboss in half the time, but it's going to keep your paper flat. If you've ever done embossing on a card and you do this and your paper curls up, heat rises. So you're putting heat through the paper, it's looking for a way to get out, and that's what makes the card look like the
Vicky.
See that heat that went through it? See it disappear? It goes through it. And not longer. Alright, so this, let me get this little area right there. You can see when it's embossed because of that wonderful shine, that sheen. And look at how it made that black ink even darker, right? So even if you're just using it and you want to use, like antique linen was one of the colors. Because I just thought, well, what if I don't want to add color? What if I just want that black to be darker but a little bit vintage? Antique linen's really nice because it's a very subtle color. You can see over the top. Almost kind of has a peachy hue to it. But it's really, really nice to add that cool effect over the top of it. So that is like the premise of a glaze. Now, a doll using the pen. This is fun. People just like, I don't know, just like coloring. It's hilarious. People name them. They have like their entire family devoted to them. So there's nothing wrong with that. All right, let's use her. I'm gonna give her a coat. So I prefer a brush when I'm doing them, just because I feel like my lines are a little bit more organic and not so perfect, but whatever you want to do. Now, when you're coloring this, because it's clear ink, and I'll show you, these pens are super juicy. Like you can see
Can I
the
pick
juiciness.
these? Thank
See the
you.
shine? Is that working for you? Getting it? Yeah? Okay. Is that working for you? Yeah. It's very, very wet. So, because it's a clear ink, and you're like, how do I know
Una
if I
mano
have it?
sola non
Just
ce la
tip it
farò
to the
mai.
light until you see that shine. If you get ink where you don't want it, wipe it off before you apply the powder. It's easier than trying to wipe the powder and the ink off at the same time. Okay? So I just suggest looking at it, saying, okay, I'm going to change this. So I'll
Questo è
leave
lo
for
stesso
hand,
colore
so
sulla
right now.
bambolina e qui sotto, è pazzesco.
So we're just going to color this on. Perfect. All right. And same thing, just going to take a glaze. We'll do some vintage photo. That'll be cool. Same thing. Let's put this on. And if you're doing the dolls, of course, you could sit there and say, okay, I'm going to do this color, a different color, and you can put your colors on. So if you're going to do different colors, I would put my pen down, do my powder, heat it, and then I would go in and do another color. Okay? I don't really like to do powder on powder because static is static. Right? So even if you went in with a pen and you put green, the static charge is going to get it everywhere. So if you want to use multiple colors, go through the full steps of putting your ink down, your glaze down, and then you're going to heat it. All right. Here's another good one. How about the dismount? Same thing. I'll try to hold it just so you guys can see that. So even on something like chipboard, it just melts very, very quickly. It is a fine powder. I wouldn't say that it's ultra fine, but it's certainly not a thick powder. And always emboss away from your finger.
It will burn.
Yeah, it will burn. Oh, look at that. So stinking fast. So you've got that great tinted, shiny, and you could still go in at this point and go in with your markers, your crayons, do whatever
Se
it is
non le
that you want to
asciugate
do.
vanno via, sono polverine, non rimangono attaccate.
So another thing we can do. Let's talk about this one. So I have a tag, I have a background. I've done with distress, whatever elements you want. It doesn't have to be with distress. It could be whatever. This happens to be done with some mica. You do this one, something like that. And you say, oh, you know what? I want to add a little element to it. So paper doesn't have a memory. So if you're one of those embossers and your paper does something, just undo it. Okay, it's not going to remember that it needed to be like that. But maybe I want to go in. I think I'm going to add some blue. So we'll do some broken china on this one. So here I will take a sprayer. And I'm just going to go in and I'm just going to add a little flick of water. And that's going to have kind of a drip right there. Next I'm going to take some of the glaze. Because I like to work with water with my
Si
distress,
attacca
you can emboss with water.
all'acqua.
Okay? So what's
Alla
nice
fine.
about that is obviously we get way more control than we would with ink. And plus I don't know how to get embossing ink to act like that. You know, I can't imagine embossing ink acting so light and faint. So this is really a great way that we can add some glaze to something that we want to distress, right? So whether you're spraying water, even if you went in with a water brush and kind of went around the edge, you can emboss with that. Because the powder is thin enough, you don't have those big chunks that go flying off. Now I will say that embossing water takes a little bit longer because you need the water to actually evaporate, right? But it doesn't take much longer. But you can see like in those areas, see this one drip I'm focusing on? Watch it. See, there it goes, there it goes, there it
That'd be
goes, there
fun
it
for a
goes.
resistant
So
ink too.
it just takes a little bit longer. Yeah, very, very cool. So this could be a top glaze, this could be a resist. In the ideology booth, you'll see the stuff is used in many, many different ways. I know that Stacy, when she did her designer spotlight project, used it as a resist behind some paper with some weathered wood. I know Paula used it as like a top layer to accent a die cut. Just a lot of different ways to use it. But I just think this, adding this effect over a background, just adding that little bit of shine, pretty cool. Especially the fact that we could then ink over the top of it. And this didn't have to be haphazard. We could have taken a stencil and sprayed some water and then get kind of that spray flourishy pattern if it was a big stencil. So the whole idea with any new medium is play around with it. So this one, instead of spraying, I did like flicking, you know, put water in your hand and just flick to get bigger drips. But you can even see how it embosses. It embosses that splat. That's just cool. Yeah. So it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, hello, Captain Obvious. I didn't invent embossing powder. I'm not claiming I did, but I'm trying to introduce a different way to use embossing powder in what you do. And by having something fully translucent, we start thinking all of the different backgrounds that we have. Man, adding some glaze and cracking it, amazing. Adding glaze to add a tint, incredible. Using it just to stamp over something where you don't have that bold image in the foreground, excellent. Putting it over the top of something textured, very cool. That's really why it was more of a glaze, because I wanted you to always think of it as like this top layer. Like, what could I do like a glazed donut? Glazed donut's on this side, it's on the top of it. So think of these glazes as what can I do to accent or alter what I've already done. And so everything that you have, from stickers to chipboard to metal embellishments, you know, it changes everything. And when you start playing around with different color combos, that's going to also allow you to either use it as its own, right? Use it as its colorant. And that's a weird thing because, you know, obviously I've been an inker for many years. So my first instinct is like, put the ink down, then do something. But for me, because the color's in there, it's just like clear and off you go. And then playing around with different opportunities of ways to either steel wool it or using it with water, that to me is what makes the distress glazes like it's just different. Very cool. So that is kind of the overview of glaze, and then we're going to talk about some other mediums. Any questions on the glaze from the front? It's pretty neat, right? It's one of those duh things, but when you see kind of all the different things you can do, you're like, okay. I get it.
Customers are asking, when are they going to be?
Yeah, water's very cool. And that was the other thing, you know, when it comes to embossing powder, because embossing powder is just plastic. Everyone's embossing powder in the world is plastic, okay? And it just grinds up differently, and there's different kind of plastics, and some are metallic plastics and opaque and transparent. But the grind is everything, right? So like ultra thick, back in the day, ultra thick embossing powder, it wasn't thicker, it was just chunkier, so when it melted thicker, right? So there was nothing about that plastic that changed it. So super fine detail. What makes it super fine is it's so delicate and almost like dust that it provides way more detail when you're embossing. So this one was kind of in between because I do love working with water. You know that. I'm like a flicker, a spritzer, a sprayer, and I thought, well, I want that with the glaze. I want my glaze to be, and you could still use it with resist spray or anything like that. With water, it's everything. Cool. Okay. So some other things that we have in the distress line, we have some new mediums, and we also have a new cardstock. And cardstock I'll talk about because I think as card makers or mixed media artists, whether we want to work with die cuts or stamps, I think we're all paper junkies. It doesn't have to be pattern paper. We're just looking for the next great texture. And so I did a paper called cracked leather cardstock, and this is available pre-cut, 4 1/4, 5 1/2, or 8 1/2 by 11. And what it is a very heavyweight paper, similar to watercolor, but I think this one's like, this is 111, watercolor is 118, close enough. But what it is, it has a texture. See if I'll pass this around so you guys get your best money shot. Texture, flat. Okay, so just like watercolor cardstock, you can stamp on either side, but when you add your mediums to it, you really get it to look like leather. So we can add this paper to a box, we can add it to the front of a planner or a journal, so we can get the look of leather from our die cuts, our punches, anything we want. And this is just done using ink, a little crayon, a little bit of paint. This one is just ink blending with some water, this is just spraying. So I just like to show swatches that there's no perfect recipe, but you can have paint cracked leather if you wanted to do like a patent leather typewriter that you were going to die cut it. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to go to the dark side like my family's like, how will it look in brown? You know, everyone else, how will it look in brown? Yeah, and then out of all, I talk about the designer spotlight, which I encourage you to see during the show. So this year what Ranger did is they took each of the designers, we were able to take our brand and we were able to reach out to 5 makers out there, right? Not 5 designers, not 5 well-known artists, just 5 makers that each had a unique style in how they used our product. There were no other rules to that. So I reached out to people thinking, well, I knew what each person did, like Stacy was one of them, like Stacy's gonna do some color stuff, Paula would be very vintage and shabby, and the Williams very soft and florally. Yeah, no. The only one I knew was gonna be grungy was Zoe. I knew that Zoe was gonna go full on brown. What did everybody do? Brown. So when I got the project back, I'm like, oh my, like Paula, why'd you use brown? I'm like, Stacy, brown. She's like, it just spoke to me as brown. I'm like, okay. Jennifer McGuire I knew was just going to be a bag of Skittles that blew up. So I knew like there was no even convincing her to use brown. I was safe. So I did all 64 colors. So that panel on the top, I'm like, well, nobody used color, I'll just use them all. But that, I think,
next time.
you'll use color. There you go. We'll get you in the mix. Absolutely. The cool thing about Ranger as well, and if you do any type of media or social media, introduce yourself to Kelly. She's here in the booth. She does social media for Ranger. I'm serious. We're always looking for makers, right? We don't have a design team, don't have anything like that. But if you're just a maker that genuinely likes the product and likes to share it, that's who we want.
You sent me my spot.
Yeah. And didn't it change your life?
It did change my life.
It was the funniest video I ever saw. You're like, I bought this sprays. I hate sprays. I don't even know why I bought sprays.
I
And
totally
yet, here
slammed
they
on
are.
it. I'm totally honest.
She did. She's like, and yet, here they are in front of me. What was I thinking? And then, like, in the very next scene, she's like, I went out and bought more. And I'm like, there we go. That's what it is. Like, so the cracked leather, when we use it, and here I'll pass these around so you guys can take shots.
Yes,
it
thank
has
you.
A very subtle texture to
Questa
it
è la
because,
carta che
as
fa
always, we still
l'effetto
want to stamp
cuoio.
on it. We still want to use rub-ons. We still want to be able to print on it if you want to run through a printer. But it's a beautiful
Do you wanna see that?
cardstock to work with. So I'll take this. I'll use some distress.
There.
Felt off.
Thank you.
So here we can go with some distress ink, or we can use a spray. Right. So my ink, I'm just going to go out onto my media mat. So if you're very light-handed, you can see that it'll leave that white in there. It's still a really nice textured paper, right? So you can see that if I was going to do pink or teal or something where I wanted it to be very shabby, I could do that. But obviously the more water or the more ink you add, you can really get this grungy. But because of the way the paper is designed, it's still designed to work with water. So your colors are still going to wick through that paper. It's still going to blend. It's not going to hold on to it, right? So you can use it this way, or we could go in with our inks or any of our sprays or stains. We can spray this down. We can take our paper, dip through it. So if you want just it to be a little bit lighter, but you can see that now the color is going to soak into the cracks. So yeah, there's no right or wrong way. It's all about play. Play, play, play. Use your mediums in so many different ways. Like you said, I've never really done it. Then that's what you should do for the next week, right? Tell yourself, I'm going to lay down the blending tool. I'm never going to pick it up. I'm going to try to use my inks without a blending tool. But it teaches you so many different ways that you can use what you have in very fun, very unique ways. I did a demo during Facebook Live, and it was just more of an afterthought. But I did a lot of new detailed stencils with Stampers Anonymous. So this release had, a lot of detailed flourishy stencils and things like that. And I thought, I don't really know if people understand the difference between tools when we stencil, because you see a lot of YouTube videos, and I think everyone is comfortable with some type of blending tool, right? It's like your little sports car. You know, you can make, you can pick this up, and you're in business. But then there's other things. There's blending brushes. There's those really beautiful makeup brushes people are using. You know, me, I'm a little more rough around the edges when it comes to my brushes because I like them just to be a little bit more. I don't know. I like a natural bristle myself. It's almost like a shaving brush. I just think that it applies ink the way I like it. Let's just put it that way. All right. Let me get. I need a few things. It's not in there. I'm just gonna slide it. No, you're totally fine. No, this thing's on wheels, man. This is like. This is legit. And I'm looking for my little shelf liner. And I thought I took it out, Tim Holtz. I didn't. What did I do with it, Ben? Ben? What did I do with it? He's like,
Perde le cose anche lui comunque, volevo
you
dirvi,
don't see a piece of shelf liner?
Insomma.
Oh, that container.
I know, it's a little square of happiness.
Dello script.
Where'd it go,
You had
Bets?
it out.
Where'd it go, Bets? Where'd it go? Did I get it out?
I didn't think you had it out.
Where are
don't think
you?
I did? Oh, okay.
Could be wrong.
Then I'll go digging.
Can you do Jack in the Box when you come out?
I
please?
will.
That'll be fine. Okay, thank you.
So you have to do the singing. Dun-dun, 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 dun-dun.
Perde le cose anche lui, io cioè, vorrei sottolinearla questa cosa, così.
It's not a very big square. It's actually a very small square.
What are you looking for?
It's not a very big square.
Vedi che anche il tavolo di Timothy si mangia le cose. C'è un problema dei tavoli, non è che. Sì, c'è anche
Drop it
Vicky.
and find it later.
Dopo la salutiamo.
It's a piece of shelf liner. I like to put shelf liner under my ink pads. Just a little square. That keeps my ink from moving when I'm inking. Right? But yeah, if you're using any kind of blending brush, you know that to do this, you need this. But if you're working, it's just nice to like not have to do this. But a brush, do a stencil. So if I'm going to just do a brush on paper,
Sì, infatti,
a
perché
brush is
uomo,
always going to give
anche
us
il
our
carrello vuoto.
softest application of color. And if you're new to inking, that's another thing that's really important to understand, is that if you're new to inking and you're only working with a brush, you're going to want to go with bold colors, because if you try to take light colors, spun sugar, weathered wood, and you're using a brush, you are going to convince yourself your ink pad is all dried out and doesn't work. And that's not the case. It's that depending on the tool, that's how much intensity of color it's going to apply. And a brush is always going to be the lightest. Because of that bristle, we can really control stencils. That was the whole point of it. So a stencil, for example, using different tools. So this is the new Tangled Stencil using a blending tool, right? Ink through a stencil, we get this effect. If you simply change by applying the same ink with a brush with the same stencil, you get a completely different detail. So anytime you're working with stencils that have a lot of detail, changing your tool from a blending tool to a brush is going to focus and get those nice thin lines, right? Doesn't mean you always use a brush, right? We can still go and use a blending tool, but if you have that detailed stencil and you're really going for that special pattern, just applying it with a brush is going to get everything to the edges. So having different tools, I think, makes a big difference when it comes to how we apply color and what we apply color to or with, right? Different tools are going to do different things. And, you know, as the industry progresses, right, when we're going into more detailed stamps or more detailed stencils, you kind of have to remember all the different tools that we have and why we have them. Sometimes you just think, oh, this is what I use and that's all I use. I'm like, well, that's what you use for that. You kind of need to change it up. So in addition to the cardstock in our distress world, we have some other mediums. Okay, different mediums are paste. Now Ranger has had texture paste and Crackle paste in their line, they still do, but they put it in the distress line for the show, put it in a little bit smaller jar, just because I think that a lot of mediums, you know, today's maker, it's like we always think that if it's in quantity, it's better. I don't think so when it comes to art mediums, because like if you have a bigger pot of something, it just dries out quicker. So when I'm designing, I'm kind of going the opposite way. It's like the taller the jar, when you use it, the more air that's left behind, and your mediums are just going to dry out. So the paste that we have, we've actually changed the size. So texture paste, we have matte texture paste. That's going to be this stuff. And matte texture paste actually dries hard and textural. It is completely matte, but what makes this paste unique is that you can put any medium over it after it dries. So you can put watercolor
Sorry.
and it will absorb watercolor.
You can step ahead. Vi faccio fare un giro veloce. Quest'anno non c'è il wifi, quindi vediamo. Allora, facciamo un giro, poi torniamo da Tim. Facciamo un giro, vediamo. Cosa c'è? Tanto lo esploriamo poi bene. Ovviamente io adesso ho preso una direzione assolutamente inconsapevole di dove sto andando, però vabbè. Allora, magari avessi guardato la mappa prima poteva essere una cosa furba e quindi chiaramente non l'ho fatto. Allora, ok. Oh, ma che bel cagnone! Vediamo un po'. Tipo volevo trovare la Sizix, la Simple Stories, Wall of Fame, anche lo Stamping Village dove ci sono Old and New, Gina Kay. Ovviamente non avendo controllato la mappa sto girando a caso, ma tanto vi faccio fare un giro. Sì, era Timolza la demo. Allora qui c'è l'area delle conferenze che non ci interessa. Sì. Facciamo un giro veloce di qua. Lì c'è l'area relax. Vediamo. Ovviamente sono finita esattamente dalla parte della fiera dove non c'è niente di quello che mi interessa, ma va tutto bene. Lì c'è Carabelli, Social Media Wolfing. Proviamo a guardare la mappa prima di iniziare il live? No, non si può, è troppo furbo. Tra l'altro in fiera oggi fa caldissimo, di solito c'è l'aria condizionata a manetta. Allora, di là c'è American Craft, potrei... Sono ritornata dalla Ranger, brava Clelia. Andiamo giù di là, va. Lì dovrebbe esserci, se è la solita struttura degli altri anni, la We Are Memory Keepers, American Craft. Qui c'è la Sizix, che ha sempre dei booth meravigliosi, poi tanto ve li farò vedere meglio. Oh, guardate che meraviglia! Poi entriamo. Qui è tutto Sizix, sì, è più qua la zona. Allora, andiamo di qua. Eco Park, quindi anche Simple Stories dovrebbe essere laggiù. E poi tra poco devo andare a recuperare, devo andare al corso a cui avrei dovuto partecipare. Sì, questa è una fiera dove c'è poca gente, perché è una fiera solo per gli operatori di settore, non il pubblico, cioè si può, ma costa $300 al giorno, quindi non c'è pubblico normale, non si può comprare niente, è una fiera in cui presentano le novità e possiamo solo fare i preordini, anche noi non andiamo via con niente. Che cos'è quello? Non so se lo voglio sapere, dopo guardo. Qua c'è il glitter. Oh mamma mia, no. E come ve lo dico adesso? Non ci posso credere. Guardate cosa hanno fatto.
But I do just know this punch size that you told me was a thing, and now
Sì, c'è anche l'off-fun. La We Are Memory Keepers ha fatto la macchinetta per le spille. Siamo tutti rovinati. Adesso vi faccio fare un giro veloce, poi una volta che prendo un pochino più di confidenza con dove sono gli stand, faccio dei live un pochino più sensati. My Mind's Eye. Allora, American Craft è qui, quindi facciamo un giro di qua veloce, poi vi lascio andare. La Button, sì, esatto. Page Maggie Holmes, Vicky Bhutan. Vediamo. Qui c'è Paige Evans, c'è proprio Paige Evans. La collezione Tuxedo di Bobani, l'ho vista, è meravigliosa. Adesso poi ci informiamo per tempi, costi per la button. Ok. Poi di qua c'è la Stickle, Trust My Craft, Basil. Allora, l'anno scorso, qui c'è la Simple Stories, l'anno scorso avevamo il wifi gratuito, noi stranieri, non local. Quest'anno non c'è il wifi, quindi in realtà bisogna vedere il mio operatore Vodafone che cosa mi consente di fare. Io volentieri. Tra l'altro mi sono assolutamente resa conto che la cosa che ho dimenticato è che mi serviva un cavalletto per tenere il cellulare per i live. Non nulla. Allora, c'è la Doodle, Babilani, ma vedere un secondo la Doodle. Oh, anche la Photoplay ha fatto delle release con gli gnomi meravigliose. Faremo tante foto. Doodlebug. Sì, qui regalano le spille e il mood della fiera. Ieri ci hanno regalato quella di Rina, di Gennaio, bellissima. Ogni stand, specie quelli dello qui c'è Eco Park, specie quelli degli Stamping Village, ti regalano la spilletta se fai make and take da loro. Qui c'è la Doodlebug, è piccino lo stand, Doodlebug e Bella Boulevard. Poi qui devo fermarmi un attimo. Da qui vi faccio una diretta in un momento in cui c'è meno confusione, però guardate, loro fanno sempre degli stand meravigliosi. Sono meravigliosi questi stand con tutti questi wash, questi abbellimenti messi qua così, da morire. Io ho visto dei gufi e non mi interessano per niente. Ok. Lo Stamping Village, dove l'abbiamo messo esattamente che volevo farvi vedere? Perché lì c'è Lofan, c'è il Tenue, c'è Gina Kay, Everiel, sono tutti lì e ovviamente non li trovo, lì c'è di Swap. Vabbè, tanto siete abituati al fatto che io non mi oriento, quindi vago per queste. Quest'anno c'è Miranda, quindi magari un pochino di più. C'è di Swap. Poi verremo a fare un giro un po' più. Allora, non lo trovo. E oltretutto potrei consultare la mappa dal cellulare con cui sto facendo il live. Allora, forse sono laggiù. Fatemi vedere, fino laggiù non sono arrivata. Poi vi lascio perché devo andare a prendere il kit al corso che ho saltato. Scusarmi, inventare una balla su perché non mi sono presentata. Allora, poi prendo le liste con le date di uscita delle cose, alcune sono già ordinabili, alcune cose in realtà le ho anche già ordinate, però tipo le glaze secondo me ci vorrà un po', perché saremo tutti lì che li aspettiamo. Qui c'è The Stem Market e poi ci fermiamo a vedere e a ordinare. Hanno sempre un boot bellissimo. Allora, Deco Art, Penny Black, Studio, ho trovato lo Stamping Village, potrei così piangere. Non si può fare sta vita però. Spellbinders. Ma allora, Art Impression non l'ho vista, ma non significa che non ci sia. Perché? Allora, Studio Katia. Low Fun. Hanno un cerchietto con le cornine meravigliose, Pink and Main. Questo è lo Stamping Village, ci sono i boot, adesso vediamo che c'è i boot. Qui c'è la Low Fun, poi andremo a vedere bene. All Tenue, sempre bellissimo. Domani veniamo a una colazione con All Tenue, quindi qui ci sono le dimostrazioni. Hi. Conquer the Ninth. Poi vi faccio vedere tutto bene, ma adesso volevo solo fare questo giro veloce. Poi di là c'è Everiel, Little Darling, Picket Fence. Questa è l'area dello Stamping Village. Lo Stamping Village è un'iniziativa che c'è dallo scorso anno, sono diversi brand che si sono uniti per dimostrare che c'è collaborazione nel settore, almeno qui è così, perché trainano il mercato, quindi si lavora bene se si lavora tutti insieme, è una grande lezione che dovremmo imparare. E fanno un sacco di demo e di dimostrazioni tutto sabato e tutto domenica. Lunedì non mi sembra. Ho già visto Jennifer Maguire girare. Ehi! Qui c'è Pink Fresh Studio. Guardiamo Pink Fresh Studio. Poi ci fermiamo bene perché ho incontrato lei, c'è il fiatone, non si può, giovedì, e fanno le dimostrazioni dei loro inchiostri, quindi andiamo a vederli. Questa qui è meravigliosa. Vediamo anche di qua. Oh, guardate, che meraviglia, tutta acquerellosa, splendida. Allora, lì c'è setup, qui c'è la wow, che adesso non so più da che parte uscire, però per andare a trovare Miranda, ma vabbè, in qualche modo faremo. Sono le polverine della wow, Little Darling, My Crafter. Ok, allora tonic, andiamo da tonic. Oh Paper Rose. Oh, Paper Rose è una marca che ci piace tanto, sono australiani. Sono koala. Sì, proprio uguale a noi, sì. Ah, mamma mia, la Nuvo cosa ha fatto? Nuove borse non ci interessano, non credo che vi interessino. Sarà un disastro quest'anno per i portafogli. Chissà come si fa per vendere gli organi sul mercato nero, non lo so, mi devo informare. Adesso giriamo la fotocamera. Allora, esco a grandissimo malincuore, ma esco, vado a cercare Miranda e vado a inventarmi una scusa per il corso a cui non mi sono presentata. Ci rivediamo dopo, poi con calma vi farò fare il giro di tutti i boot che mi piacciono di più. Abbiamo 3 giorni fino a lunedì pomeriggio dopo pranzo, quindi insomma abbiamo un po' di tempo. Più piccola dell'anno scorso la fiera, quindi mi manca Catherine Puller, mancano diversi marchi, però vabbè, di anno in anno ovviamente i partecipanti cambiano. Fa caldissimo, mamma mia, e adesso cerco di uscire dalla parte giusta possibilmente e di recuperare Miranda. Ci vediamo dopo, ciao! Se riesco a spegnere.